3 years with Ethan Scott taught me that a man can be perfect on paper and still feel like a blank page when you're the pen dying to write. He never raised his voice, never rolled his eyes, never once made a scene, and all my friends called me lucky because stability is rare, girl, and I believed them until the night I fell down the rabbit hole of his past with Grace Miller and realized my stable ocean used to be a hurricane for someone else, that he had once argued and begged and laughed too loud and kissed away tears like a man who could not bear to let go, and that knowledge sat in my chest like a pebble in a shoe, tiny, constant, impossible to ignore. The pebble turned into a rock on a gray, rainy evening in Manhattan when I sat in his G-Wagon, cracked the window to watch the fog ghost across the glass, and deliberately tapped my coworker's voice note because I was tired of feeling nothing reflected back at me, and the message played, "Emily, I don't care how many times you turn me down, I'm not giving up," which was embarrassing and annoying and also exactly the kind of bait a normal boyfriend would at least side-eye. But Ethan just gave me a small, amused look and said, "Wow, you've got more charm than you think." Like we were discussing the weather, not a man ignoring my relationship status, and the laugh caught in my throat like a fishbone. I asked, "Why don't you ever get jealous?" And he shrugged, eyes on the slick blacktop. "Why would I? I trust you, the way surgeons talk when they've done this 1,000 times and nobody has died." And I pressed, "Okay, so what's your line with other men? Where do I cross it?" And he said, "Steady hands at 10 and 2, just don't cheat." Like the bar to move him was set somewhere past the edge of the map, like wanting me was a math proof solved once and filed away. I pushed again, softer, so if I fell for someone else, "You'd be fine," and he flicked me a glance. "If you did, you'd tell me. I'd respect it." And that was the moment I knew I could swing with all my weight and still only punch air because nothing in him would wobble for me. I was already bracing for that strange, familiar emptiness when the world lurched. A hard jolt slammed us forward. His forearm snapped across my chest to hold me back, and we coasted to a stop without hitting the car in front. We got out, rain stitching the street with cold needles, and behind us a battered Porsche idled, doors flying open. A couple spilling out mid-argument was snapping. She was snapping back, and then the woman's gaze met mine and time did a weird, rubbery stretch because it was Grace. Not just any Grace, but the Grace whose photos I had seen on Ethan's phone a week ago at 2 in the morning when his trust meant no passcode and my heart meant reckless. The same face I had stared at while scrolling through a history I wasn't part of. And as her eyes slid past me to Ethan, his phone slipped from his hand and clattered on the wet pavement, which would have been funny in any other universe, because this is a man whose hands don't tremble when he's holding a scalpel. The Porsche's driver mumbled apologies. "My girlfriend and I were fighting. I didn't see you. Should we call insurance?" And Ethan shook his head. "It's fine." Like the scrape on his bumper was nothing, which it was, and he guided me back to the car, opening his coat to shield me from the rain. I sat there watching in the side mirror as Grace stood on the shoulder, small and fierce in the storm, and her eyes clung to the disappearing shape of our taillights while I tried to read Ethan's profile for any crack, any ripple, anything, but his face stayed composed and his voice stayed even. "We're almost there." And then, 20 minutes later, he pulled to a stop and I rolled down the window and said, "This is the firm," because it was the same place he'd picked me up from. He blinked like he'd just woken up, closed the window, signaled, merged, and I watched the red brake lights smeared across the rain like a painting while my chest bottlenecked with cars and honking and everything that can't move forward. We looped the block, and when we passed the crash site again, Grace was still there, arms wrapped around herself, mascara bleeding, the Porsche gone without her, and I felt the snap in Ethan before he moved because his fingertips clenched on the wheel, and suddenly we were braking hard, and he was out into the storm. Voice raised in a way I almost didn't recognize. "Grace, are you insane? You've been standing here an hour," and in that instant I was no longer a girlfriend in a car but a witness on the curb, watching the man I love spend his heat elsewhere. She choked out, "Ethan, you never left me like this." And I could see his shoulders sag and his hand tremble just enough to make me dizzy with the knowledge that he could shake, just not for me. She slid into the back seat, took the tissues he handed her, and he finally turned to me with that level polite tone that made me want to scream. She's a friend. We'll drop her first. And I didn't ask why the friend didn't say hello earlier because I already knew. Because sometimes the past walks into the present and nobody wants to introduce it by name. We stopped by the herbal shop because he'd promised to pick up my tea, and while he was inside, Grace leaned forward and said quietly, "I'm his ex," then added, like a proverb that tasted like vinegar, "Love is a tree planted by someone else later, girls, just sit in the shade." And I stared at the rain diamonds on the glass and thought, I hate shade. I'm always cold. The truth was I knew more than she guessed because a week ago she had messaged him asking to talk, and he had smoked half a pack on the balcony he'd supposedly quit for good. And in that soft blue light of 2 a.m., I had opened the unguarded door of his phone and found a museum. Custom Lego sets he built for her over 3 nights, handwritten letters dated once a year, a star registry certificate with her name. Silly jealous texts where he told other men to back off and pulled her into a kiss with a grin. Is it sour? Arguments where she stormed out 3 steps and he pulled her back with red eyes. Grace, don't leave me. Breakups that read like cliffhangers and reunions that looked like fireworks. I pieced together a version of Ethan I had never met, one who was messy and needy and blatantly alive, and it made me feel like a tourist in my own relationship, like I had been given a beautifully bound book with half the pages glued shut. When he came back carrying a paper bag that smelled like earth, he looked every inch the man your parents dream about, broad-shouldered, steady, the right kind of handsome, the right kind of kind, and I thought how easy it is to say yes to a life that makes sense. The mortgage-ready checklists, the reliable calendars, the pre-approval of every auntie at Thanksgiving, and how hard it is to ask for sunlight when everyone is telling you shade is practical. He drove Grace home first, and she thanked him in a voice that curled like smoke. And then we stopped in front of my place and the air between us cooled, and I said, not yet the nuclear truth, but the match you strike before it. Ethan, do you think compatibility or love matters more? And he answered, without blinking, compatibility, the way a man answers his specialty on rounds, and I laughed a little broken laugh because I wanted him to ask why, to ask what I meant, to fight me for once, to say both, to say me. But the car hummed and the wipers kept time and the future sat there like a neat, labeled file. I could have told him then that I don't want to sit under a tree someone else planted, that I want the dumb, inconvenient sunburn of being loved out loud, that I want him jealous enough to kiss me mid-sentence and stubborn enough to run after me and soft enough to confess he's scared. But I swallowed it because I knew if I said all that he'd simply say, I hear you, and offer to adjust something small. Like a man fixing a squeaky hinge while the foundation cracks. Instead, I pictured 18-year-old me chasing his shadow down school hallways, pictured every time I had engineered proximity the wrong private room date, the second setup that, coincidentally, happened to be him, pictured my mother's practical voice, my father's quiet disappointment about the jar of mixed nuts he kept buying me because Ethan kept buying him and Ethan never noticed I left them untouched, and I felt this wild, reckless clarity that was equal parts grief and relief. I thought about how we met in a mistaken room and how, maybe, we'd been in the wrong room ever since. Talking about Nolan and Kawabata and pretending we both liked fishing because mirroring is easy in the glow of a first hour, and I realized I didn't want to be a mirror anymore. I wanted to be a face someone walked toward, not a reflection someone politely complimented. Outside, the rain softened to a hush, the kind New York does when it's done scouring you. And he waited for me to say something he could file, and I opened my mouth and felt the first syllable of a goodbye I wasn't sure I could pronounce, the kind that dismantles a wedding website and collapses 2 families' plans and refunds a honeymoon to Turkey. I didn't speak it, not yet, because part of me still wanted to give him one more chance to be the Ethan from the photos, not for her but for me, to prove that the hurricane wasn't a phase but a capacity. And part of me knew that asking that was like asking winter to be July, so I looked at him, at the careful way he held the wheel, at the calm that had once soothed me and now made me feel invisible, and I said instead, can we talk tomorrow? Which is code for maybe I'll run and maybe "You'll chase," and he nodded, of course, and I went upstairs to an apartment that suddenly felt too neat, too quiet, like a hotel room after checkout, and I stood at the window and watched the taillights fade and told myself this is not a crisis, this is a choice. If love is sunlight and compatibility is shade, I was about to step out without sunscreen and see if the warmth was worth the burn, and I didn't know yet that a week from now a second chance would step off a train in Chicago wearing a familiar smile and the posture of a man who doesn't offer shade at all. He offers a path and a pace that fits mine, but that is for later. Tonight is just the last soft hour before the storm I'm going to start. The next morning, I woke up to the kind of silence that doesn't feel like peace, the kind that hums under your skin because you know a conversation is coming that will split your life into before and after. And I made coffee just to have something warm in my hands while I stared at the wedding binder on the counter. All those color swatches and vendor receipts lined up like soldiers waiting for orders I was never going to give. I hadn't even spoken the breakup out loud yet, but it was already living in my chest like a tenant who paid rent in dread, and when Ethan texted me mid-morning just a simple, "Are you free for lunch?" I stared at the screen long enough for the coffee to go cold before I typed back, "Can we talk tonight?" which was as good as handing him the loaded gun and telling him I might pull the trigger. The day dragged. Work emails blurring into each other until I found myself rereading the same paragraph 3 times, my mind looping over memories like a bad highlight reel. Our first date after the mix-up, that time he brought me soup when I had the flu, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, all the tiny gestures that had convinced me for a while that quiet love could be enough, and yet every single one was now overlaid with the image of him standing in the rain with Grace, his voice cracking for her in a way it never had for me. By evening, my resolve had crystallized into something almost calm, like deciding to finally cut off hair you've been growing for years, knowing it will be lighter afterward even if you miss it in the mirror. And when I slid into his car outside my building, I didn't bother with small talk, just folded my hands in my lap and said, "Ethan, I think we need to end this," and his head snapped toward me like I'd spoken in another language. He didn't let me reach for the door, his hand closing gently but firmly around my wrist. "Why?" "We're getting married in 3 months. Like logistics could cancel the truth," and I met his gaze and asked, "Do you think it's possible to have both compatibility and love?" And he answered too quickly, "Compatibility." As if love was the indulgence you cut first when the budget gets tight. My throat tightened, but I pushed through. Why can't both matter? And the silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in 3 years, until I answered for him, because love makes people irrational, and marriage demands stability, and he didn't deny it, just sat there with his jaw working, and I realized I hated his calm as much as I hated my own practicality. I stepped out into the cool air before I could change my mind, walking slow in case he chased me the way he once chased her, but the space behind me stayed empty, my steps landing on the wet pavement like the slow clap of an audience that knows the ending, and when I reached my door I understood that whatever fire had lived between us had been spent long before I arrived. The next day I went through the motions of telling our parents, bracing myself for my mom's explosion. "Do you know how many women would kill to have someone like Ethan?" While my dad's sigh from the kitchen cut deeper than her words, "He's been buying you those mixed nuts for 3 years and never noticed you don't eat them. Maybe it's better this way." And I felt oddly grateful for his quiet rescue. Ethan tried to take the blame, texting me late that night, "If you're sure, I'll tell them. I'll handle the deposits." But I wouldn't let him clean up my choice, replying, "I'll tell them myself and I'll cover the costs," because the least I could do was own the fallout. The weeks that followed were a strange kind of detox, the apartment both too big and too small without him, my phone lighter without his predictable check-ins, my heart slowly relearning its own rhythm, and I thought maybe this was what freedom felt like, not joy. Exactly, but the absence of weight. Still, the city has a way of throwing old ghosts at you, and one afternoon in Soho I saw them, Ethan and Grace, her arm looped through his smile the real, unguarded one I'd only seen in photos from before me. And though it hit like a sucker punch, I kept walking, telling myself this was proof I'd done the right thing because he looked alive, and I refused to begrudge him that. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere along The way I had stopped asking to be chosen and started asking only to be kept, and maybe that was the saddest part. A month later, work sent me to Chicago for a court case, and as fate loves drama, opposing counsel turned out to be Ryan Carter. The guy from college whose back I once mistook for Ethan's, the guy who had actually asked me out sophomore year only to be met with a polite no because my heart was already occupied, seeing him across the cramped courtroom table, all sharp suit and easy grin, was like having a door I'd forgotten about swing open, and during a recess he leaned in and teased, "You still following me around?" which made me laugh for the first time in days. We ended up grabbing dinner before my flight, and over burgers, he admitted. "I used to think I met you too late, maybe I didn't," and for a second I let myself picture it, but old habits die hard, and I shook my head. "We're almost 30, Ryan. Long distance isn't realistic," and he just smiled like he knew something I didn't. 2 weeks later, I found out Wada showed up in the break room at my firm with a mug in his hand and a new employee badge around his neck, saying, "Figured I'd make it realistic." And it hit me then. This was what it looked like when someone actually walked toward you instead of waiting for you to drift into their orbit. He didn't ask for promises, just said, "I'm not here to rush you. I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere," and for the first time in years, I felt the flicker of something warm that had nothing to do with compatibility checklists or what made sense on paper. It was reckless in its own way, but so was I. And maybe that was the point. When Ryan walked into my life for the second time, this time carrying a cardboard box of desk supplies and wearing that infuriatingly confident smile, it felt like the universe was trying to prove a point I wasn't ready to hear. Because here was a man who didn't just say he wanted me, he rearranged his life to show up in my city, in my workspace, in my daily coffee line, and the difference between that and everything I'd known before was dizzying. He settled into the office next door to mine like he'd always belonged there, showing up in my doorway with files, jokes, or sometimes nothing but a lopsided grin and a lunch that made the rest of the floor glance up like they were watching the start of a rom-com, and, though I kept telling myself I needed time, the truth was I was already letting him in, inch by inch, without the barricades I used to think were necessary. Then one Thursday evening, we grabbed dinner at a little Italian place near the courthouse, the kind with string lights tangled in fake ivy and a wine list that could bankrupt a junior associate, and halfway through my plate of pasta, I looked up and saw Ethan and Grace being seated across the room, their tables so close I could hear the scrape of their chairs on the tile. And for a heartbeat my stomach flipped like the past was trying to claw its way back into the present. Ethan saw me first, his expression caught between surprise and something softer, and Grace, ever the social tactician, smiled politely and said, "What a coincidence," before tilting her head toward Ryan. "Is this your boyfriend?" And Ryan, without missing a beat, grinned and said, "Not yet, but I'm working on it," in a tone that was playful for the room but steady enough for me to feel the weight beneath it. Ethan's gaze flicked to him, unreadable, but I caught the subtle shift in his jaw, and before anything else could be said, his phone rang, and I watched his face change entirely as he muttered, "My grandmother's missing." Already half out of his chair, Grace reached for his arm with a light laugh. "She probably just went for a walk, don't overreact," and Ethan shot her a look I'd never seen him give anyone before, sharp and almost hurt. "She has Alzheimer's, so could you forget that?" And something in my chest twisted because I knew, in that instant, how alone he must have felt in that moment. Before I could think better of it, I leaned across to tell him, "She still has the tracker watch I got her, check the app." And his eyes met mine with a flash of recognition before he pulled out his phone, saw the location pop up, and exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "Thank you," he said quietly, and as he hurried out, I realized how strange it was to be both the person who could help him and the person who was no longer his first call. After they left, I excused myself to the bathroom, only to overhear Grace's voice in the hallway, teasing, "Don't you think her friend's back looks like yours?" And Ethan's reply, low and delayed, "Does it?" I hadn't noticed, which made me pause because I knew exactly who she meant and exactly what she was trying to stir. When I got back to the table, Ryan didn't ask why my expression had shifted. Just handed me the dessert menu and made me laugh until my cheeks hurt. like he was quietly proving the point without ever saying it. A week later, he invited me to help him stock his new apartment, which meant wandering the aisles of Target debating throw pillows and kitchen gadgets until the cart was stacked high enough to earn us 3 raffle tickets for a store giveaway, and on a whim, he handed me the last ticket, saying, "You've got better luck than me," and I, half joking, half bored, tossed it into the box and somehow pulled the grand prize, a fully paid trip for 2 to Turkey. He looked at me like I'd just conjured gold out of thin air and said, "Guess we're going on vacation." And I didn't even pretend to argue because the idea of traveling with him felt like exactly the kind of reckless I wanted to be. Later that night, my phone lit up with a message from Ethan. "Grandma's fine, she was looking for you. She said she missed you," and I typed back, "I'll visit her soon," without thinking about how complicated that might be. When I showed up at her apartment a few days later, she hugged me like nothing had changed, calling me her granddaughter-in-law in front of Ethan, who lingered by the doorway like he wasn't sure whether to join the moment or protect it from reality. And when we left, he walked me to my car and asked, "Are you free over Memorial Day? I'd like to take you to dinner, to thank you," and I shook my head. "I'll be in Turkey with a friend," and I could feel the question he didn't ask hovering between us. I got into my car, started the engine, and for the first time in months, I didn't look back in the rearview mirror, because I was already driving towards something new, and maybe, just maybe, toward someone who had already proven he wouldn't stand still when I started to walk away. Flying into Istanbul with Ryan felt like stepping into a version of my life I hadn't dared to imagine for myself, one where I wasn't clinging to scraps of attention or bending myself into shapes to fit someone else's rhythm, but instead was simply chosen. Without negotiation, without hesitation, the city unfolded around us in warm golds and deep blues, the call to prayer drifting through the air like a heartbeat, and Ryan made it his mission to make sure I saw and tasted everything, from tiny cafes tucked into side streets to sprawling bazaars where we got lost in a maze of silk scarves and copper lanterns. On our second day, he surprised me with tickets to the Museum of Innocence, a place I'd read about years ago in a book but never thought I'd actually see, and walking through those rooms, each object a love letter to someone who once existed, I felt my throat tighten, especially when we reached the wall lined with over 4,000 cigarette butts, each carefully labeled by the man who had collected them from the woman he loved. Ryan glanced at me and smirked. "If I collected all your coffee cups, you'd call me a creep," and I laughed through the sting in my eyes. "No, I think I'd be impressed." And he shook his head like he was filing that away for later. A few mornings later in Cappadocia, before the sun had fully breached the horizon, we climbed into a wicker basket with a dozen strangers, the burner roaring overhead. And as the hot air balloon lifted, the entire valley below transformed into something out of a dream, fairy chimneys casting long shadows, the earth painted in shades of pink and ochre, dozens of other balloons drifting like giant lanterns in the pale light. Somewhere in that suspended moment, Ryan pulled out his phone and handed it to me, a video already cued, and when I pressed play, I realized it wasn't landscapes or tourist shots, it was me. Dozens of clips he'd secretly taken over the years since we'd reconnected, me walking ahead of him, me laughing at something off camera, me tucking my hair behind my ear, all the quiet moments I never noticed him watching. "I guess this is my own little museum," he said, his voice softer than the wind. "I've been waiting for you to stop chasing a shadow so you could see someone running toward you," and my eyes burned in the sharp morning air because in that instant, I finally understood what it meant to be loved in the way I'd always wanted, present, deliberate, and without condition. I teased him to keep from crying, "You're a stalker," and he grinned, "Only for you," and we stayed like that until the balloon dipped low enough for the pilot to call for landing. The flight back to New York was almost 11 hours, and somewhere over the Atlantic, turbulence jolted us hard enough to make the cabin gasp. The plane rattled violently, the lights flickered, and for the first time in my life, I watched people pull out their phones to type what could be their last messages. My hands shook as I sent my best friend a short note telling her I loved her and giving her instructions if something happened, unable to send it directly to my parents because I didn't want to scare my father with his heart condition. When the plane shuddered again and dropped so sharply my stomach flipped, Ryan's hand found mine, steady and warm, and over the roar of the engines he leaned close. "Emily, will you be with me?" And I didn't even pause before saying yes, because in that moment, there was no space left for doubt. By the time we landed safely at JFK, dawn was breaking over the skyline, and I stepped into the arrivals hall feeling like I'd been handed a second chance at everything, only to freeze when I saw Ethan standing among the crowd. His eyes scanning until they found me, his expression breaking with something raw I couldn't name. He looked like he'd been there for hours, but when his gaze dropped to my hand still linked with Ryan's, something in his posture shifted. Ryan excused himself to grab the car, and as soon as we were alone, Ethan stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "You're okay, that's all that matters." And before I could respond, he added, almost like it hurt to say, "I saw the video." And confusion washed over me until I realized my best friend, the one who'd filmed pieces of my years-long crush, had sent it to him after hearing about the flight scare, maybe to shake him the way he'd once shaken me. The footage wasn't just snapshots, it was a timeline following him through school corridors, writing his name in margins, telling her the night we started dating, even the drunken confession months ago when I admitted I'd wished for him on my 18th birthday. His eyes were locked on mine. "I didn't know you loved me that long. If I'd known, maybe," but I shook my head because I'd already rehearsed this ending. "It doesn't matter now, Ethan." And that's when he dropped it like a card on the table. I broke up with grace, his gaze searching my face. "Don't go with him, stay." And for a second, the version of me from 2 years ago almost said yes, but I wasn't her anymore. I pulled my hand free and said, "I'm with Ryan now." Walking away before he could hand me the kind of stability that always came too late, not realizing that our paths would cross again sooner than I thought, in a place where the past had once begun and where, for him, it clearly hadn't ended. A week later, I found myself walking through the familiar gates of my old high school for the anniversary celebration, the air thick with nostalgia and the faint scent of freshly cut grass. And I wasn't expecting to see Ethan until I spotted him on the winding spiral staircase that had been the backdrop for so many teenage memories, his tall frame outlined against the light streaming through the windows. The sight yanked me backward in time to our very first encounter, when I was 16. Drowning in an oversized jacket my mom insisted I wear because it was my brother's and still perfectly good, and a group of boys at the top of the stairs had been laughing about it until Ethan, younger and lighter than, stepped in with that calm smile. "They're unisex. Haven't you seen that before? She wears it better than I do," before telling everyone to get to class, and just like that, a stone had dropped into the still water of my life, sending ripples that reached all the way to this moment. As we crossed paths now, his eyes lit with recognition. "So it really was you we met that early," and there was a softness in his tone I hadn't heard before, but I just smiled faintly, unwilling to open doors I'd already closed. Night fell quickly, and the school's anniversary fireworks began, bursting over the field in cascades of color, and I was standing with my phone raised, sending a photo of the glowing sky to Ryan, when Ethan's voice came low beside me. "Your favorite author isn't Coabitites Marquez. You don't actually like fishing. You love photography. You prefer Spielberg over Nolan. You hate spicy food and you never eat nuts. I know now, Emily, and I'll remember from here on." And my chest tightened because it sounded like a promise arriving years too late. "Let me walk toward you this time," he added, eyes reflecting the gold and red exploding above us. But before I could respond, another firework went off, spelling the school's name across the sky, and I pointed at it. "Look." But by the time he turned, it had faded into nothing but smoke, and he said quietly, "Too late, I missed it," and I wondered if he realized how perfectly that summed us up. When the event ended, he offered to walk me out, but I gestured toward the car waiting by the gate. Ryan leaning against the hood, smiling when he saw me, and I saw Ethan's expression dim just slightly. I got in, watching him in the side mirror as he turned to leave, his shoulders squared, but his step slow, the kind of slow that made it hurt to watch. And I knew it was the first time I'd ever seen his back look small. Ryan, catching my glance in the mirror, asked with a half-smile that carried more weight than he let on, "So what's it like to win the lottery and then let the ticket expire?" And I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Never won, so I wouldn't know," before teasing, "But you should wash your carrot, smells a little sour," which made him glance in the rearview mirror at a sleek black G-Wagon behind us and smirk. Maybe I should trade up, and without thinking, I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his until they fit like they had always belonged there. The breeze from the open window carried the faint scent of spring flowers, the city lights flickering past us, and I thought about how long I'd spent being the quiet, self-conscious girl trailing behind a boy who never once turned around. How many years I'd measured my worth by proximity instead of reciprocity. And how different it felt now to sit next to someone who didn't need me to chase him because he was already here. There was still a piece of me that would always remember the 18-year-old version of Ethan, the one in a white shirt under the summer sun who lit up my youth, but the woman I was now knew that some seasons aren't meant to return, and that was okay, because after winter, spring always comes, and in this one, I wasn't standing alone in the cold anymore. I was moving forward, towards sunsets and starlight, with someone whose hand never let go. Spring in the city has a way of making everything feel like it's on the edge of something new, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone to notice. May was already being seen. Ryan, and I fell into a rhythm that felt both effortless and intentional. Morning coffees turning into late-night walks, workdays punctuated by him leaning against my office doorway with that easy grin that always made me forget whatever deadline I was stressing over, and somewhere between the grocery runs and weekend brunches, I realized that the constant hum of anxiety I'd carried through my years with Ethan had gone silent, replaced by this steady warmth that didn't need grand gestures to prove itself. Still, the city has a way of tossing the past into your path, and one Saturday afternoon in Central Park, as Ryan and I were stretched out on a blanket under the shade of a budding cherry tree, I saw Ethan across the lawn, walking alone, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the crowd. Until they landed on me, he paused, like he wasn't sure if he should come over, but then his steps carried him forward until he was standing at the edge of our blanket, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, Emily," he said quietly. And I could tell he'd rehearsed it, like he didn't trust himself to say more, and I nodded, introducing him to Ryan, who shook his hand politely but with the kind of firm grip that says, "She's with me now." There was an awkward pause, the kind that hums with unsaid things, and then Ethan glanced at the book by my side, Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, and said, "I finally read it, you were right," his voice softer now, almost a confession. I smiled faintly. "Told you." And for a heartbeat it felt like we were both standing in the space between what we'd been and what we'd never be. And then Ryan asked if I wanted ice cream, breaking the moment and pulling me back into the life I'd chosen. As Ethan walked away, I didn't feel the sharp ache I used to, just a quiet gratitude for the part of my story he'd filled, even if it had ended in shadows. Weeks later, Ryan surprised me with a trip upstate to see the cherry blossoms in full bloom. The trees heavy with pale pink petals that fell like soft rain when the wind blew, and standing there with his hand warm in mine, I thought about the girl I used to beta, one who thought love was proving yourself worthy of being chased, and how far she'd come. Love now felt like sunlight after winter, steady and nourishing, something that didn't leave you shivering under someone else's shade. As we sat on a bench, watching the petals drift into the water, Ryan leaned over and kissed my temple. "You look happy," he murmured. And I realized I was not in the fragile way that depends on someone else's mood, but in the grounded way that comes from choosing someone who always chooses you back. And maybe that's the thing about season, they change whether you're ready or not, and when spring finally comes, it doesn't erase the winters you've survived. It just makes you grateful for the warmth, for the growth, for the fact that somewhere along the way, you learn to stop chasing shadows and start walking toward the person already waiting for you in the sun.